world, which is another way of saying the epistemological and ontological fact. I really do ask questions in my research and in my classes, like, what is water? Is water alive? Where does land end and the ocean begin? Where, do islands even end at all? But always, and most importantly, who gets to decide? And this is no mere intellectual flex. As I show, these questions get right at the foundations of some of the most pressing and practical global environmental policy. But what exactly is the line? And again, I'm using the line singular in a way that's distinct from lines. So in his book, The Invention of Rivers, landscape architect Philip de Cunha draws attention to the long history of what he calls the line. He writes, "This line does not simply separate water from land. It creates water and land on either side of it as entities that can be commodified and as such coveted, made scarce, and violated." For de Cunha, land and water do not pre-exist as separate elements in the pure land-only and water-only form. So his starting point is a world of fluctuating co-saturations, which sounds kind of fancy, but think about silt in the river, or that the river is actually dry right now, I've heard. The moisture content of the soil, the moisture content even of the concrete making this dock, the clouds, the dew, or snowmelt as it's seeping into aquifers. By the line, de Cunha means a way of seeing and building worlds that organize land and water as discrete, fundamentally different substances. A way of seeing that's culturally specific and learned, with long origins in Europe, which are then imposed elsewhere. A way of seeing that brings specific kinds of worlds into being, with the line drawn on maps, embanked in soil, buttressed with concrete, practices of separation and containment carve land and water from fluctuating saturations. And so on the expedition to the garbage patch, I performed this line with my hesitation, with my descriptions of water that slices, and most of all, with the language of my field notes and my experience at the time of an ocean that separates rather than one that connects. The line is not a question of whether Oahu, the island, ends at the high or the low tide line, but the assumption that the island ends at all. I could not see the continuities of land as the seafloor, or of seawater as it rains into the soil from the sky. So imposed on Hawaii and so many other places, the line is a technique of colonial power. De Cunha traces its emergence to a particular classical Greek worldview. And here's your reminder, courtesy of Western philosophy, that we can't blame modernity for everything. Sometimes humanities people are laughing. So de Cunha ascribes the colonial expansion of this worldview to Alexander the Great, who happened to be a student of Aristotle. And so Alexander the Great's conquering campaigns, which were famous for their militaristic might, also counted among their ranks a brigade of scholars tasked with describing geographic features in meticulous detail. Their landscape-defining practices embody a particular form of vision that de Cunha refers to as Alexander's eye, a god trick of seeing land not only as a map from above, but simultaneously something drained by rivers that lead downhill to the sea. And it's from this perspective of the line as Western elemental boundaries that de Cunha asserts rivers are inventions, not naturally occurring features to be discovered, but, quote, acts of design. Writing of the Ganges in India, de Cunha argues that the imposition of the line provides the foundation for the British colonization of India that, quote, survived and thrived on keeping water contained. The Ganges as a river, de Cunha declares, is colonized rain. At the same time, the line that marks the river becomes a condition of possibility for understanding monsoon saturations as disasters. Without the line to be transgressed, without attempts to contain water on a downhill path in isolation, there can be no flood. These elemental boundary drawing practices bring natural forms of rivers, land, water, coastlines, islands, and associated crises like floods and droughts into being. So lines themselves, and I'm back to lines plural again, are not inherently colonizing. As many feminists, and especially Black feminist scholars, have long argued, the problem is not difference, but difference as the basis for separation and domination. The trouble with the line, singular, is the way it enables geographies of exclusion. Its binary separations bring into being the very ground for all kinds of enclosures and hierarchies. the line as a colonizing logic that divides rather than connects, right? The line, the ocean that separated me rather than connected me to Vancouver, works to foreclose responsibility as it encloses elements in ways necessary for capitalist extraction. With the line of separation, water and land become bounded in ways that can be owned and sold, protected, and polluted. So let's take this image from a very much cited report in Nature titled Evidence the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is Rapidly Accumulating Plastic. And it's also currently the featured image, last time I checked, on the Great Pacific Garbage Patch Wikipedia page. And so this is an Alexander's eye view drawn from above of the model concentration of plastic per unit of sea surface as predicted for a particular point in time. And so it's kind of a snapshot of this swirling continuum of plastic saturated seawater. And it's been mapped into distinct classes of mass of plastic per square kilometer of ocean surface, color-coded, delineated, and named. With colors evoking a terrestrial topography, I cannot help but see the, quote, modeled mass concentration as deep water in dark blue, the shallows of the light blue, the yellow beaches, and circumscribed with a black border, a decidedly earthy form from which several peaks rise. With a solid outline, the visualization brings the garbage patch into being as a discrete entity separate from the sea, a garbage patch trash island. And to emphasize, this is not a satellite image, but a model of plastic concentrations at sea. And this is the exact same zone where I took the picture that looked like empty ocean from the boat and what we visually could see, you know, like 15 feet above the sea surface every day. Okay, it gets more interesting. Another version, same data, different presentation of this garbage patch has been taken up by the nonprofit The Ocean Cleanup, a very prominent organization with a huge budget, and I'll come back to them in a few minutes. But their version of this uses, very notably to me in this particular case, the same deep blue color to demarcate not only the plastic accumulation from supposedly clean ocean, but with the continuity of that very same blue color, similarly marks political lines of nation-state boundaries. While I'm assuming this was a design choice motivated by the desire for a contemporary brand aesthetic befitting a youthful, tech-advancing nonprofit, this accidental equivalence is especially telling. The elemental boundaries of plastic ocean and land water, tracing the form of the garbage patch, are betrayed as achievements as political as the outlines of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. With no pretense of being a natural landform, the garbage patch helps make visible the radical contingencies of all kinds of water borders, the violent cuts that are ongoing choices. The line, with its top-down view, puts land on one side and water on the other, is very much caught up in seeing ocean plastic accumulations as island forms. But from my perspective, especially writing this talk for today, what makes this vision of a garbage patch island so compelling is how it betrays expectations that the open ocean is an empty space, a space defined by a lack of land and a lack of human presence. The enduring power of the garbage patch capitalizes on expectations of a pristine ocean and the shock value of it being spectacularly trashed. Human products in the Pacific are only surprising when the ocean is assumed to be an empty, cut-off wilderness. Carved by the line, the edge of the ocean becomes the end of history and the beginning of a void. So islanding is a term that ocean and especially island study scholars use. And islanding means this kind of broad obsession with boundedness and discrete entities in Western culture, but also more specifically, the set of practices, including what I've been calling the line, that bring islands into being as a particular kind of geographic form, small, distant, isolated islands in the sea, right? These kind of tiny specks of land separated by a vast, vast ocean. And in this sense, islands too are inventions, acts of design, science, empire, and the imposition of ways of seeing. Western obsessions with containment bring islands into being as colonial forms. And so here I'm going to bring the oceanic term islanding in conversation with its continental cousin, wastelanding. As defined by environmental historian Tracy Boyles, wastelanding is a technique of settler colonial frontier that deems already inhabited lands, quote, undesirable, unproductive, or unappealing, end quote. And along with this, the devastating practices that bring them into being as such, with all the racial violence that this implies. So writing of Dene dispossession in New Mexico, Boyles describes the forced removal of indigenous people and the subsequent destruction of centuries-old farmland and orchards to render them into empty desert, fit only for extraction and pollution, for filling with mine tailings and radioactive waste. And so both wasteland-ing and island-ing turn down into verbs, challenging what are assumed to be pre-existing geographic conditions, empty land and ocean wildernesses, respectively, by focusing on the often violent processes that bring them into being, that shape them according to those ways of seeing, to that imagination. In this sense, the Pacific Ocean and the Chihuahuan Desert might seem like polar opposites. Ocean, all water, in the desert, supposedly no water. And these conditions might seem like facts, abundance and scarcity, as total separations of conditions of water. But both the desert and ocean alike have been defined by scarcity in similar ways, with shared assumptions of the scarcity of life, and especially of the human presence. On the boat, we made explicit and repeated references to the area where ocean plastic accumulated most densely as literally a desert. That word is in my field notes many times. And sometimes this was with the nuance of deserts as spaces that are too often profoundly misunderstood, right? This didn't mean the open ocean was lifeless, just that life was, far apart. Fish were few and far between. It was there, but just not a lot of it. But my constant surprise by how the plastic waste we pulled out of the ocean over and over again was teeming with life, hovered and gooseneck barnacles, home to oysters, sea slugs, and snails, or providing shelter for whole pools of fish, betrayed my underlying expectations, right? That this was a desert in the narrow sense, misunderstood sense of not a place of life. And so while preparing for this talk, I was searching for parallels with the Chihuahuan Desert. And Google's AI search suggestions were accidentally very helpful, if in all the wrong ways. And the top suggested search question was, no joke, do people live in the Chihuahuan Desert? Not kidding. I was like, ooh, this is presentation gold. Keep going, Google, what's next? And not much further down is there water in the Chihuahuan Desert? As if there would be nothing but sand. And so the terms that make an oceanic garbage patch so shocking also make desert wetlands an oxymoron. Though I have to say, having arrived in the dust storm last night, y'all may need to work on the image. It's a lot of sand in the air. All right, but both ocean and desert share the image of these immense empty spaces where there are no humans, that are well understood to be hostile to life, if there's life at all. They become obstacles to be crossed, especially by settler narratives. And indeed, the vastness of the ocean and the desert. Whoop.
Just turn off, okay?
That's okay. Happened in class last week and it restarted the computer for 2 hours. You're a little traumatized. We're good. Okay, so both the ocean and the desert share the image of immense spaces empty of humans and hostile to life as obstacles to be crossed. Okay? And indeed, the vastness of the ocean and the desert are arguably the same. Vast actually shares its Latin root vastus with waste. Ooh. Yeah. And so here the parallels extend to the creation of empty spaces, these kind of empty natural spaces that can be used for science, for the military, laboratories, as spaces of experimentation.
Yeah. Watching you.
All right. The case of islands, right? There's this whole promotion of this narrative that islands are these distant, contained spaces that can be made waste safely, quote unquote, by places for nuclear testing. And so again, I'm drawing parallels here with the testing that was in the desert Southwest and that then moves to islands in the Pacific, which are supposedly more contained, right? More isolated, and even less people. And so most famously infamously rather, in the Marshall Islands, islands and their inhabitants are wastelanded by nuclear weapons development. Land is blasted into ruins, and racialized bodies are rendered radiation experiments without consent. The Pacific in its vastness becomes the ultimate sink for waste, literally the world's largest basin to be filled with pollution, right? Both nuclear and plastic. Yet far too often, the line is also positioned as the solution. And so let's return to the ocean cleanup, right? So this nonprofit, they get tons of media attention, and they had a $52 million budget just for 2022. Yeah, lots of attention. And the organization's goal is to, quote, rid the ocean of plastic by developing technology to extract plastic pollution. And I want to emphasize extract is their term here. And so what is especially striking about the ocean cleanup for me, beyond being another massive techno fix for saving the status quo of continued plastic production, but what stands out here in particular is how explicitly the organization articulates its work as an elemental separation project. So not only does the very possibility of extracting plastic from the ocean depend heavily on seeing and maintaining plastic/ocean and land/water divides, the organization prominently describes the project in terms of creating, quote, artificial coastlines where there are none. The ocean cleanup's coastlines are massive nets, themselves plastic, suspended from long floating booms, also plastic. And in the original version, these booms were supposed to be anchored to the seafloor, but more recent tests proved that wasn't very feasible. And so they've been using 2 ships to kind of tow a big U-shaped net, something like a mile or even 2-kilometer long net boom situation across the ocean. So these floating barriers, again, their words, are meant to capture plastic for removal by mimicking the way plastic washes ashore on beaches. The line that makes the ocean an empty space that is pollutable also makes plastic waste extractable. The same logics extract plastic to make new, even inhabitable land at sea. So as spectacular as this image of recycled island might seem, this vision of new plastic land is a much older idea than the garbage patch. Petrochemical colonial ambitions have long been by design. This recycled island and many others have eerie precedent in plastic industry dreams that prefigure garbage patch science by many decades. Plastic was already being positioned as an era-defining substance well before human agency was conceived as having the kind of geologic force that defines our current Anthropocene moment, and well before associated harms were understood as fully planetary environmental crises. And so this is a 1940s Fortune magazine article on the state of the plastic industry. And in this 2-page spread, it takes on absolutely distinctly continental form. So Synthetica, a new continent of plastics. And this image is a photograph of an actual model where every little plastic state is modeled actually from that plastic substance, delineated land from ocean, and the ocean is a sea of glass. So elemental divides, they were on it. And so this was molded from these materials by Orthoplastic Novelties Incorporated. You can see there's melamine, vinyl, nylon, lakes and rivers of acetic acid. I'm not sure if you can see the tiny detail, but there's acetic rivers, course without irony to the translucent sea. And clearly ocean acidification was not really yet on the radar. And so Synthetica maps a decidedly petrocapitalist geography where borders are mapped with molecular precision and new land is made of plastic. And this is what I argue in my forthcoming book that will also have an open access PDF, is a synthetic frontier. So state power and corporate rule here collapse into branded cities. There's Bakelite, the capital of the phenolic. Cellulose is a great state, something like Texas, floats the legend. Texas just keeps giving back to me. Before introducing rayon, a plastic island off the coast. So Synthetica emerges as territory whose very existence as land depends on resource extraction and elemental manipulation. But a much more recent proliferation of synthetic frontiers might look like this: more floating barriers, which I'm assuming are made of plastic, in the Rio Grande. And these have me asking again, on whose elemental terms are state borders defined? So, well, Google search results have also assured me that no one lives in the Pacific Ocean, only on islands. So many Pacific Islanders have long considered themselves quite literally people of the sea. Their worldviews constitute a sea of islands, joined by the continuity of the seafloor, connected by currents, and navigable by stars. Pacific Island peoples see the edge of the ocean as the presence of elemental connection. In the 1990s, Tongan and Fijian writer Pele Pauopa famously articulated the tensions generated as a sea of islands was reduced to islands in the sea. And that's in the same move that makes that ocean the empty void, right, between land masses, as opposed to connecting them. As he writes, as continental men, namely Europeans, on entering the Pacific after crossing huge expanses of ocean, introduced the view of islands in a far sea. From this perspective, the islands are tiny, isolated dots in a vast ocean. Later on, continental men, Europeans, and Americans drew imaginary lines across the sea, making the colonial boundaries that confined ocean peoples to tiny spaces for the first time. These boundaries today define the island states and territories of the Pacific. I've just used the term ocean peoples because our ancestors, who had lived in the Pacific, thank you, Google, for over 2,000 years, viewed their world as a sea of islands rather than as islands in the sea. So the imposition of the Western line reduces a sea of islands to cramped spaces, to tiny scraps of land deficient in resources. Sovereignty becomes dependent on narrowly circumscribed relations to dry land that limit movement and cut relations of being able to travel relatives on other islands. The resulting tensions are especially palpable where the descendants of voyaging peoples, whose identity is inherently the traveler, have to grapple with demands that indigenous land claims be made based on static grounds of continuous occupation since time immemorial. Though nation-state borders in the Pacific and elsewhere continue to be mapped as coastlines, state control now extends territorial relations into the sea. Exclusive economic zones, EEZs, formalized in the 1980s, extend sovereign rights to national resources 200 nautical miles offshore. The nautical miles are slightly longer than regular miles, in case you were wondering. From the perspective of what Brian Russell argues are better understood as border borders rather than border lands, the United States has more sovereign ocean than sovereign land. Yet sovereignty remains securely anchored in the requirements of dry land as articulated by the line. As climate change laps at the shores of small island nations, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea continues to define an island as a naturally formed area of land surrounded by water, which is above water at high tide. Tuvalu, halfway between Hawaii and Australia, is one of many island nations rapidly losing ground. And I just had to catch myself from saying small island nations, because that phrase just flows so naturally. So the more I talk about this, the more I see how ingrained these ways of thinking are. And so in Tuvalu, the largest island, has an average elevation of just 2 meters, so 6.5 feet above sea level. And it's already experienced 15 centimeters, 6 inches of sea level rise over the past 15 years. And current predictions have half of the main atoll submerged at high tide by 2050 and more than 90% by 2100. All the while, seawater continues to infiltrate freshwater sources. And just last September, Tuvalu petitioned the United Nations General Assembly for permanent recognition of its maritime boundaries, irrespective of whether they stayed above water or not at high tide. The ongoing negotiation of a UN declaration of sea level rise set for 2026 must consider new models of statehood that include uncoupling sovereignty from the requirement of land understood in Western terms. And more pragmatically, the stakes are also very much about the future of Tuvalu's control of fishing rights in their EEZ, which extends 900,000 square kilometers, when the islands in these Western terms are something like 26 square kilometers of land. So that's ongoing right now. But even in celebrated cases, the land water line continues to endure in Western terms. So in New Zealand, where mountains and a river have been awarded legal personhood status, the very existence of a line separating land from sea explodes from a philosophical question into a site of practical politics. As geographer of oceans, so this is the top-down view of the same mountain. I thought I'd give you the side view first so we knew what we were looking at. So as Kate Samler, who does really excellent ocean work, describes in her account of protests against undersea mineral extraction that's possibly happening just offshore of New Zealand here, At stake is sovereignty and control over ocean resources. So with legal personhood awarded to Mount Taranaki, a volcanic peak, right, that's right at the cusp of the Pacific, Indigenous Maori and the New Zealand government shared guardianship is fraught with a fundamental disagreement about where exactly the mountain ends. For the settler colonial government grounded in Western ontology, the mountain stops at the shore, at the line dividing land from seawater, which demarcates the seabed as a state resource where extraction can continue. For Maori, whose worldview and associated articulation of responsibility constitutes landscape and seascape as an interrelated whole, the mountain extends to the seafloor, the same seabed whose rich mineral deposits have been earmarked by industry as the next frontier for large-scale resource extraction. And it's my understanding a lot of these deep sea minerals are instrumental in the development of our quote-unquote sustainable technologies and our green energy transition. Just a good reminder to think about what we mean when we use those terms. And so here, defaulting, despite bringing Indigenous people into governance, despite giving personhood status to a mountain, this default to holding the line of the Western land-water divide props up infrastructures of containment as appropriate responses in place of other kinds of relations with land and water and other kinds of land and waters. But there are other ways of borders in the Pacific. Traditional Hawaiian land divisions have boundaries. The main division, the Ahupua'a, takes its name from the words for common boundary markers where offerings were placed. Hawaiian cartographies, however, map connectedness. They are not based on the line of the Western land water and all it contains. The very concept of land doesn't carry the same meaning. So though the word aina often gets translated as land into English, its more literal meaning is that which feeds. And many Kanaka Maolis and Native Hawaiian scholars are reclaiming this literal meaning, right, as lands and waters who feed. So aina, including land, sea, and society, by definition, envelops humans in relations of reciprocity with all kinds of kin, including plants, animals, and features of the land. The nation of Hawaii's governance system was, and many are working for it to be again, configured on shared wealth rooted in water, rather than individual wealth tied to land as private property. The lines that bring worlds into being do not have to be grounded in domination. In her mappings of refusals of the elemental foundations of Western power, Hawaiian-born Candace Fujikane beautifully makes visible Kanaka Maoli cartographies that map shared abundance with water rather than a scarcity of dry land. Hawaiian divisions, she emphasizes, are defined by their relationality their relationality with that which lies on their edges, borders that are not boundaries of separation, but themes of relationality. In place of oceans that separate, continuities of water above and below ground connect land across great distances. Moreover, seams of relationality trace relations of responsibility rather than severing them through enclosures that enable extraction. Kanaka Maoli have a kuleana, a concept that at once encompasses obligation and privilege to care for land. And again, land here means water and people and everything together. In the words of Mehanavan, recounting a conversation with an elder, with kuleana, identity is tied to, quote, that which is yours to take care of. You become known by how you use that to create abundance for others. These lines are explicitly genealogical. Kanaka Maoli are descendants of the land. Land and water are not inert substances, but teachers of how to listen, live, and care in relations of reciprocity. So island peoples have a rich history of refusing cramped spaces of bounded isolates. Before and after Ipeli Ha'opa's famous rallying cry for the Sea of Islands, many scholars have been repeating similar refrains. Vicente Diaz, Filipino scholar and writer from Guam, has similarly declared no island is an island. People's indigenous epistemologies and cartographies of the reef, right? So that vision of Hawaiian boundaries that extended past the shore to the reef. But for him, it's coming from Guam. And uses this to, quote, destabilize the stubborn foundations of land that remains unmarked. So here, fluid seascapes are questioning of the very elemental lines themselves with, quote, region and tradition of traveling that trouble hard lines between land and sea, as well as between many other categories typically understood to be diametrically opposed to one another. And so it's not enough to substitute water for land, the desert humanities for the hydro humanities. The task requires reconfiguring the ontological grounds in order that in order to confront the line itself, right? And another final Diaz quote here, to combat exclusive categories of self and other, and the bounded territoriality on which they are fixed, right? And dry land is not at all the same as that which feeds us. And so I would like to end by returning to where we began, but hopefully transformed. Another trip to Hawaii, where I got to take this picture, this one in 2023. And as the plane banks towards Oahu, I look down again at the deep blue ocean, brightening to cyan near the shore, at green hillsides fading into the mist of a sea that's taken to the skies. And this time I see it, not a plastic island, but the line cutting together apart where once I could have only arrived at land, naturally isolated in an unimaginably vast sea. I returned to the harbor where I first boarded the Sea Greg and taking photographs of colonial land-water divides, trying to imagine an ocean that connects rather than separates, trying to imagine worlds of exploration without conquering. Maybe if I squint just right, maybe if I keep listening. But in Pearl Harbor, a glossy sheen of oil continues to seep from the USS Arizona in a spill too patriotic to clean up. In hills above, jet fuel leaks from military storage facilities into drinking water. What shape is cut by the line that connects the underground sprawl of fracking wells reaching under my North Texas home to the ongoing contaminations of Oahu's aquifers? And so I'm still only beginning to glimpse what it means to see and not see the line. See islands that are not islands, worlds without synthetic frontiers. See how colonial entitlement to land logically extends to making it, from what in the Western worldview is the middle of the largest watery place on the planet. The Pacific Island peoples, with their rich histories of refusing, cramped bases, show us the ways that other islands already exist, other ways of water, other ways of oceans that are already being lived, islands that are made together with seams of relationality, that are already catalyzing new trajectories and new forms of abundance. And in the desert too, stories of abundance are countering conditions of scarcity, as exemplified by Dr. Selena Osuna's work being done right here at UTEP. And so, as ending, how might we further bring about world where solutions to scarcity are not more floating barriers, but the many lines of responsibility, myriad oceanic relations? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I know some of you need to go, so if you do need to go, we can go ahead and take off. We are going to announce the winners of the poster session this morning. We will have time. If you have questions for Dr. Wolff, please stick around. We're going to be having lunch. And so it'll be more in this room over here. Intimate questions, but we did want to at least allow you to have some time to ask questions. So I'm going to hand it over.
Any questions?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, the winner.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
All right, everyone. So we're gonna quickly announce the poster winners for today. So let me just open up the presentation, which is straight away gonna tell us who the winners. That is if it loads eventually. Maybe we need to close this one out.
And people can grab some food next door if they need to leave too. Yeah. Stop loading. We can just send out to Louise if you want.
Snap.
You want to just announce it, please? Oh, there
Okay,
we go.
yeah, all right. So on third place, I will need to put this on presentation mode. Alfredo Dagna Torres from Environmental Science and Engineering. Congratulations. And for second place, Abayomi Omoguna for I spelled it right, and then from chemistry and biochemistry. And for the first place, Aaron Robbins from ecology and evolutionary biology. Dr. Walsh is going to contact you eventually through email so that we can organize for the prices. All right. All right. So just so you know, third place is going to get $100 to help with his research. Second place is going to get $200. And the first place is going to get $300. Congratulations. And last but not least, we want to thank the judges.
There's a slide.
The posters, so slide 2, okay. There we are. Dr. Kevin Floyd, Dr. John Moore, Dr. Brian Grajeda, well, I'm not a doctor yet, but Luis Garnica, Dr. Kerry Schaefer, Dr. Luis Garnica again, I don't know. Dr. Hamidreza Charifan, Julian Hernandez, and Alejandra Sanchez. Thank you for your questions. And now we're going to leave some time for questions for our keynote, right? So we have another microphone here. We'll leave one with her. So questions, comments. I'm scared now.
Everyone might just be hungry.
Everyone hungry?
Talk to me or sandwiches.
There's a question here. Let me
So-
turn this on.
I'm pretty loud.
What about the people on Zoom?
There, yeah.
Oh, yes. So the solution of this nonprofit, putting out this floating bunch of plastic, with nets, I mean, this is already a huge problem in our oceans. Has there been criticism from the environmental community back to this organization and like-minded, activists?
Yes. and on multiple fronts. So right from its like very beginning, ocean scientists were like, you can't anchor that, you can't this or that. But the critique from the scientific community tended to be one of the technological infeasibility. And so that kind of sometimes just spurs people along, like, well, then I'll technologically fix it. And so my critiques of these solutions, I try and take on a much bigger level of like, what does that fix for who, and what persists? And for me, the relations that persist are relations of extraction and continued plastic production. And you can clean up all the ocean all you want, but it's just going to keep ending up there. I was just on a research trip on the Gulf Coast last week. Spring break on the Gulf Coast, terrible life. But I was picking plastic off the beaches. I brought some samples, and the tide line there is just awash in plastic fragments. And so there's this huge emphasis, and they're funded by the people you would expect to fund end-of-line cleanup projects. They get $52 million in 1 year. And all I get is, I don't know, right? So yes, tons of critique, but my question is always like, on what scale are we critiquing things and what becomes untouched? And the same thing happened with the Recycled Island project. That was the habitable island. So his first vision was to develop the island that was already there. And when he found out, I've interviewed him like legitimately, when he found out there wasn't an island, he's like, well, we'll just have to build one first, right? And so this image of an island, and I tried to make this more about water desert than just that island. The book is a lot about the island. That it becomes so powerful that the absence of a plastic island becomes the problem itself that you solve by building a plastic island so you can carry on your solution. And I think this helps us see the limits of technological fixes and problems being reduced only to technological problems. It's not that technology is bad or we shouldn't have any of those fixes, but I think this is, did I just turn that off or did it die?
So,
is that better? Yeah. Bump the button. But why we need the humanities, even if what we do can seem nebulous or like not fully important, But if people listen to more humanities scholars, maybe some of us here would have some of that $52 million instead of continuing to see plastic out of the sea. And you can't just, I could go on that for, a whole book, and I do. Thank you so much. It's a big question.
Thank you very much for your presentation. If you hang around here all week, you'll hear a lot about models. There's a lot of scientists here, and they do a lot of modeling, particularly with respect to water. This is water-based. We talk about groundwater modeling, we talk about river models, and in some cases, these models, or the results of these models, or what the models say, are used to advise people in management and policy positions who themselves are not scientists, elected officials. Do you have any thoughts, humanistic, ethical perspectives on the use of models, especially when they advise policy managers?
Oh, that's really tricky. But I think my main piece of advice, and it's hard because it takes time, is that whatever kind of research we do, we explain our process. So, but it takes time, right? It's like, here's the garbage patch. You're like, whoa, it's an island, right? And so I guess it's like, and it's so hard because it's like we're not given time. But slowing down and explaining your process. And I was actually really impressed with a lot of the poster presentations I got to be part of this morning, the way people really were explaining their process, how the research was being done. And when I asked my humanities perspective questions, it explained to me where it came from, what it meant, and what its limitations were. But this gets more complicated. So that original rainbow colored island topography research was actually funded by the ocean cleanup themselves. The ones who want all the money to go clean up the ocean happen to fund science that made an image that looked a lot like really dense plastic in the ocean. So I got some questions. And again, like I'm not faulting the science or saying the measurements are off or wrong, but like that even when we're doing things meticulously that look objective, they're caught up in bigger projects than us, right? And we can't control how those get taken up in the world. So yeah. Ask a humanities scholar specifically. That's a great question.
It was a very nice presentation. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. I guess my question, or one of the things that I found very interesting, is that you mentioned the photo of the, I'm not sure, there was an atomic bomb that was being dropped on the islands. And I think one of the things that sticks with me is that chemistry, there's the isotope carbon-14. And because of the atomic bombs, there's so much more carbon-14. So I think many people don't appreciate it, but because of these atomic bombs in any experiment in chemistry, you will see that isotope and that direct relationship because of atomic bombs just follow the world and the environment. So my question is, I was curious if these things are being mitigated. There's like reduction in weapon testing because of like the actual impact it has. It's how drastic it is.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful example because this sort of idea, the myth, this is Elizabeth Billigree's a literature ocean scholars concept. She called it the myth of the isolate. It's actually the atomic, whatever, I can't remember the organization's name right now, but it was actually like the Federal Atomic Energy Commission who promoted this image of these islands as bounded when it wasn't any more politically acceptable to drop bombs in the desert. They're like, well, these islands, they're cut off, they're far. Your example is beautiful because it shows how much that was a myth, right? It's literally everywhere. It was not contained at all. So I can't speak as much to the containment of those specific nuclear blasts, but my research also unexpectedly got caught up in the 2011 Japan tsunami and the Fukushima and everything else that happened, right? So the triple crisis. And that actually happened. I went on the boat in July 2011 and the tsunami hit in March 2011. And so part of my research ended up seeing how the sort of terrain of plastic pollution shifted after that. And there were a lot of fears in Hawaii that the plastic washing up would be radioactive as part of what was happening. And there was also some fun conflation of models between radiation models and current models and people getting very confused. But the surprising thing that happened is when organizations like Surfrider that do a lot of beach cleanups all over, but especially in Hawaii, they were concerned enough about this radiation that the government gave them Geiger counters so they could check their beaches to make sure their cleanups were safe to proceed. And last I heard, the only radiation they found was from unexploded US military ordnance washing on the beach. So just in terms of how all of this is connected to these like really complicated structures of militarism and capitalism and colonialism, and just what exactly the US is doing in the Pacific and
Go around.
Hi, I want to ask, many of these issues that we're facing, the global community are deeply rooted in the economies that we basically live on, and right in the economic models that sustain our way of life. And so I can see, how this is very powerful because it goes to the root of the philosophy of our way of living. But I was wondering if, somehow your research intersects with some of those economic roots and try to address, these issues from that perspective.
Yeah, so it's like so many ways. Like, how is capitalism connected to colonialism, connected to environmental degradation, climate crisis? The answer is just like yes. But I think like more specifically looking like in the case of this talk, I'm talking about the land water line here, but it's still that sense of enclosure and private property and commodities being the basis of our economic system, that you have to have competition, that the goal is to hoard the most wealth, to accumulate, not share. And so these critiques of scarcity coming from indigenous island peoples and also from desert people being like, we live here, there's water here, are very much pushing against those kinds of foundational conditions that make capitalism happen. But I think it's also important to remember that, whatever work we're doing now, Western science, and I include academia, myself as a humanities scholar in this, is its origins are caught up in the origins of capitalism. And so like the first kind of the need to meticulously describe biological specimens was part of like Dutch, especially like global cultures trying to go find commodities and catalog their wealth and bring them back, right? So the practice of meticulous, careful observation and description that morphed into modern science was already caught up with capitalist goals at the beginning, right? And so again, and this isn't, I love science, I've done work in marine ecology labs, but not losing track of the ways these are all connected. And so the line here also includes the lines that separate us into science buildings and humanities buildings as well, and also our shared roots in those kinds of systems and what our work is in service of, whether we mean it to be doing that or not. I get paid. I'm an employee of the state of Texas. I'm getting paid by all money. So I like what I'm doing with it. But, right, what is my wealth rooted, such as it is? I've been an assistant professor in Texas. But, yeah, what is my wealth rooted in?
And it kind of segues a bit. I was going to ask about. I really loved that you incorporated the etymology of like the Sea of Islands, islands of the sea, and thinking about the etymology of all these terms. And I'm sure maybe some of us need to remember as grading sweetgrass. Okay, so there's a lot of that composition of how indigenous languages have a lot of verbs as their way of knowing, like the bay and the river are verbs. And I wondered if you had any terms that you would think are useful to coin for us to incorporate all of these ways of knowing that you've shared with us today, that you would share with policymakers.
Yeah, that is a big question. So as a settler, I'm hesitant to casually appropriate indigenous terms. I can think of a whole bunch of them, But I think more importantly than that is like thinking about place-based ways forward and talking to like who are the people where you live and what do forms of abundance or other ways of living. What are those terms right here? I'm not saying we should take the terms from Hawaii and do them here, but showing that as a model of like, how do we look where we are for our versions of doing these things otherwise? And there's all kinds of cool indigenous terms. I'm actually teaching grading sweetgrass next week in my classes. Thank you. And I've also been playing an Inupiaq video game with my undergrads this week, thinking about environmental philosophy. So I was doing yesterday before my flight. And the Inupiat language as well has this structure where the subject comes at the very end of a sentence and you can't tell what it's about until you get to the end. So like you have to have patience to understand. You can't jump to conclusions. You can't know the meaning till the end, and it just teaches us a much different way of being. And also the way verbs work kind of brings subject and object and verb into one thing. So instead of being like, I teach, you learn, it's like a verb that would mean like, we're learning together, to be learning together, like all of the words. There's other terms I've come across. I can't remember where right now. I've been reading so many different things. But just this concept that means to have enough. Right? And that is a version of abundance, right? Where everyone has enough. And so that's the opposite of thinking desert scarcity is like, we need more water. But what does it look like here for everyone to have enough water, right? And what can that be? And so where I was just in Corpus Christi last week, they're putting in new desalination plants right now. It's been hugely controversial. People there were telling me about the drought conditions. There's no water. But 80% of the water use there is by the petrochemical industry. And almost all the water the desalination plants will produce is going to produce more plastic, part of the petrochemical industry, creating the conditions of climate change that are causing drought in the first place, right? And so what does it mean to have enough? And to me, that is not abundance, right? But thinking like, who is here, right? This is a beautiful community with so many things here that I can't tell you what they are, but that would be my non-answer.